The gospel lesson for today is taken from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. And you can find that on page 71 of your Pew Bible if you would like to follow along. Just then, a teacher stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" He answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus answered, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved to pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Captain. When Presbyterian minister Fred Rogers was a student at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in the early 1950s, he had been working on an idea for a new type, a different type of children's television show. Rogers, having been one of the founders of the public television network in Pittsburgh, saw an opportunity to use the freedom of that network to not only educate young children, but to explore their inner lives, their fears, their joys, and their feelings. To get a solid foundation for this idea, Rogers began working with University of Pittsburgh child psychologist Margaret B. McFarland, an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry. The first manifestation of Rogers' work on WQED was called The Children's Corner. The set of the show was a drawing of a castle and a clock on a sheet that had a hole cut in the middle. The puppet characters that Rogers developed emerged from the hole, inviting the children to join them into the land of make-believe. The Children's Corner continued that way quite a long time, from 1954 to 1962. But Dr. McFarland was concerned that only the voice of Fred Rogers was heard on the show, either speaking the character parts or singing the original songs that he wrote. McFarland told Rogers, children cannot be left in the land of make-believe if he expected them to take any lessons from the show into their real lives. She encouraged Rogers to appear on the show himself in order to create a bridge between the real world and the land of make-believe. Together, McFarland and Rogers came up with the idea of the neighborhood, a real-life concept that children could understand. It was around this idea of neighborhood and neighborhood that Rogers premiered in 1968, the final manifestation of his creation, titled Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. As the show continued and grew with unprecedented success, other neighborhoods were added to the neighborhood of Make-Believe. And every show began with the musical question asked by Mr. Rogers as he changed into his comfortable shoes. Won't you be my neighbor? Young children could understand the idea of neighborhood, and they could understand the idea of neighbor while at the same time incorporate that real idea into their imaginations. Thus, the imaginary worlds that children constructed were occupied by real voices that talked about real feelings that children experience. Truly, it was revolutionary. Rogers made it very clear from the beginning that though he was a Christian and a pastor, he had no intention of creating a religious show that might exclude any child. Yet, the Christian themes of love, sharing, forgiveness, control of anger, and self-worth permeated Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. No one can say if Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan had any influence upon Fred Rogers' approach to his children's show. But what we can say is that both focused on the common feelings that human beings share, and both received the same positive and negative reactions to this approach. The attacks upon Fred Rogers' show focused on the fact that he emphasized making children feel good about themselves as they were, without demand for any social conformity. The parable of the Good Samaritan also suspends the distinction between those who need help and those who deserve help. And this was certainly not an acceptable way of thinking in Jesus' culture. In Luke's story, the proof of the distinction between people who need help and people who deserve help, a distinction that still remains today, was summarized by the question that presaged Jesus' parable. And who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That question, asked by a lawyer who was probably also making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem on the same road, was grounded in the religious reality and cultural reality of Jesus' time and in the history of Israel. Palestine, divided between Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, was not a monolithic Jewish culture, but a mixture of many communities, each with their own distinct languages, traditions, and religions. There were Romans, there were Greeks, there were Samaritans, and a host of other Mediterranean peoples. From this dynamic mix emerged tribal mentalities that set very clear and specific barriers between languages, classes, nationalities, and religions. Tribalism is common to all of us, to everyone, to the world. Knowing this helps us to understand the religious urgency behind the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? The lawyer begins by asking Jesus what he must do to inherit eternal life. Jesus responds, what do you read in the law? To which the lawyer responds with the Shema, a text which was the heart of Israel's religion, a text which every righteous Jew recited every morning and still do. After the lawyer's correct recitation of that passage, one that every righteous Jew knew by heart, Jesus replies, do this and you will live. Now, you've heard me emphasize the word do in this conversation, and that is actually how this passage is written in the Greek. It emphasizes that word and does so for a purpose. That is what the religion of Israel was about, doing. The law said, this is what God says you must do. And it was the obligation of the righteous believer to obey. Interestingly, though, the lawyer does not want to end the conversation there. He wants Jesus to answer the question that had been at the center of debate among Israel's religious leaders for centuries. Who do we include in the word neighbor? And most importantly, who can we exclude? Who can we exclude? Israel's traditional answer to that question was that all the circumcised and their households were neighbors and were to be treated fairly under the rubric of God's law. Everyone else was outside the love and mercy of God and could therefore be subject to discrimination or judgment or hatred, even violence, but also just ignored, like they didn't even exist. There was no moral obligation under Israel's law for any believer in God to do anything for those who weren't their neighbors, except perhaps for the immigrant who was willing to be circumcised. Jesus does not answer the lawyer's question directly. Instead, Jesus tells a parable. What is important, one of the things that's important about the story of the Good Samaritan is that it reflects exactly what is happening in the moment that Jesus tells it. Jesus, his followers, the other Jewish pilgrims, the lawyer, are making the journey to the Passover on the same road that the characters in the parable are traveling. It's a real-time story, and it may even be describing something that everybody knew had happened. And I often wonder, as I read this, from the lawyer's question and Jesus' answer, I wonder if the lawyer had done this. Because it would be typical for the lawyer to do that, to pass by on the other side. I kind of wondered about that. It was dangerous to travel on the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. It was a road plagued by bandits and gangs and murderers. It was very unsafe. Very. The victim in Jesus' story, who is traveling alone, which is very unusual, is stripped of his clothing and left naked and bleeding on the side of the road, meaning that no one would be able to identify the tribe to which he belonged. This deprived anyone in the story a chance to make a moral decision on aiding that victim based upon religious dogma or cultural prejudices. In other words, for those who saw this man, there was no guidance for what to do, how to respond. Lacking the guidance, the two characters in the parable who lived by the moral restraints of religion and the cultural constraints of the tribe, their people decided to do nothing. For both the priest and the Levite, literally, their religion, their culture had paralyzed them. They were struggling with a conundrum, the lawyer's conundrum. So how does one decide what to do without the help of God's law or the proprieties of one's group, one's tribe? It is in the character of the Samaritan that Jesus gives us the answer to that question. When he saw him, he was moved with pity. Have you ever been moved with pity? Have you ever been moved with compassion by something or someone that you saw? Has that ever moved you to do something in response? Jesus focused on the human emotions, the feelings that would demand a caring response to the need of the victim. And that certainly was a victim in need. The priest and the Levite knew they could help because nothing about the victim prevented them from doing so. Even their own law said that if somebody a neighbor was hurt or wounded, even on the Sabbath, you could help them. The law said that. But for the sake of their religious beliefs, or their cultural prejudices, or simply because they didn't want to be bothered, they decided not to chance disobeying the law, which is a good excuse for not doing it. The parable concludes with a final question that Jesus asks of the lawyer. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The lawyer said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, and listen to the language, go and do likewise. Once again, the demand to do that which God expects of those who love God emerges. But this time, the motive is not religious obedience or cultural acceptance and tradition, but simple human decency and compassion. What Jesus is doing here is turning the lawyer's question on its head, transforming it from who is my neighbor to whose neighbor are you? And the lawyer answers that question in so many words definitively. I am a neighbor to anyone at any time who needs one. In asking the question, won't you be my neighbor? Fred Rogers also focused on that which makes us human. Our emotional and physical dependency on each other. Children who live their lives dependent upon others. Caregivers, grown-ups, teachers completely understood Mr. Rogers' neighborhood because it was the world in which they lived. But Jesus makes it clear that for those who would be his disciples, that is the same world in which we of any age must live. That is why Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Do we bear the heart of a neighbor this morning? Are we willing to open our eyes to the needs around us, wherever they are, whoever may bear them, and respond with acts, with doing acts of love and mercy? Martin Luther King Jr. summarized the parable of the Good Samaritan this way. The first question which the priest and the Levite asked was, "If I stop to help this man, what will happen to me?" But the Good Samaritan reversed the question. "If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him?" What is happening now, today, this moment, to those around us who suffer in need? They may need our forgiveness. They may need our generosity. They may need our presence. They may need our time. They may need a word of kindness, or a prayer, or a smile, or a word of encouragement. They may need a hand. But above all else, such lives need our compassion, just as we need the compassion of others in our time of need. Mr. Rogers did something amazing when he spoke to adults. And you've heard me share this before from the pulpit. He said, think of someone in your life who helped you to be the person that you are today. A time when you needed. That's something we can all do every day. Thinking about that and saying, who needs us today? I think we can conclude with absolute certainty, I hope so, because he's a Presbyterian minister, that Fred Rogers knew exactly what Jesus meant when Christ told the story of the Good Samaritan. And Rogers dedicated his life, his ministry, to creating a caring and compassionate neighborhood for children all over the world. But all of us who believe in Jesus, all of us who call ourselves disciples, are called to create compassionate neighborhoods of our own. Places where people are first and loving it is above everything else. Mr. Rogers' question is still a good one. Still a good one. Still played on television and around the world. But it is not one we ask. It is a question asked of us by the suffering, by those who live in the margins of our communities. Won't you be my neighbor? How will we answer that question today and in every day of life that God has given to us? What, O Lord, shall we do?